Good evening. My name is Alina Shoutsova. I am an immigration attorney from Brooklyn, New York. And today we continue our legally speaking seminars um, with his or her asylum application. It is actually one of the most common questions that I receive. What to submit with my asylum application? A person who is in the United States um, probably is already aware that he or she should file Form I-589 if he or she would like to ask the government of the United States to grant to be granted asylum. However, many are confused about what evidence they need to present, if they have to present any evidence with the form, together with the form. So first of all, if one is filing for asylum without an attorney, he or she should read instructions to the form I-589 thoroughly. I find these instructions to be a little bit confusing, so let me explain what I mean. Somebody who is asking for asylum first has to submit one original and and two additional copies of asylum application and everything else that the person is would like to submit, uh, something that should be taken into consideration together with asylum application. To the asylum application, a person must submit evidence of identity, if available, of course. If not available, the person will have to find secondary evidence of identity. Well, the primary evidence of identity will be a person's passport. So instructions pretty clear on what basic documents should be submitted with asylum application, like photo, copies of the passport, actually full copy of the passport from cover to cover, maybe evidence of identity such as a birth certificate with a translation. But the instructions, of course, do not specify what particular evidence one should submit with his or her application. And it's understandable because it is impossible to list all evidence that might be submitted, because the evidence actually will depend on the facts of the case. And in each particular case, um, it will be decided separately, pretty much. So how one would be able to understand what needs to be submitted? Well, it's actually, that's where a lawyer would be helpful. It's actually, sometimes it's a kind of a thinking and legal process one has to go through to understand what would court or an asylum officer would want to see to make sure that the application for asylum has merits. For example, well, first of all, with one's asylum application, one should submit his or her affidavit, a declaration, or sometimes people call it a story. Basically, in a narrative format, one has to explain what happened. So the officer or the judge would read it and understand why this person is afraid to go back to their country. And then that's one part. Actually, this story, this declaration or affidavit is a very important document. And then what the person has to submit would be evidence itself. Let's start with official evidence that one can find. By those I mean medical records, for example. If a person claims that he or she was physically injured, it's only reasonable that an officer or the judge would ask to see medical records, because in most situations, a person who suffered physical injury would go to see a doctor afterwards for treatment, or just to make sure that the person was not harmed very seriously, or for treatment. So of course, an officer or judge in the United States would expect to see those records. Another thing would be if a person claims that he or she was detained, records of arrest, detention, conviction. All the documents have to be translated into English language. What if you don't have that? Well, you might have pictures, photos of the injuries. What if you don't have photos for some reason? What if the circumstances were such that you had to leave everything behind you, you were afraid to take evidence with you? Well, maybe a person who witnessed those injuries will be willing to submit an affidavit and would be willing to maybe sometimes testify in court if the person is available telephonically or in person. So it would be basically witness testimony. Sometimes people, I find that real witnesses are not willing to help somebody who is filing for asylum, because very often they're still in the country from which a person is claiming persecution, and they're afraid that the government or group that is persecuting the applicant will retaliate against the witness. In these situations, a person can go to a doctor in the United States, and very often past injuries, they still have the physical manifestation. Maybe it's a scarring, maybe it's something else. Psychological evaluation also will be taken into consideration. So if person suffers serious psychological harm, such a person can go and see a psychological expert, doctor, psychiatrist, or psychologist, who will run special tests, will administrate special tests. Doctors, they have their own methodology, how they evaluate a person, and will produce a report stating that in their opinion, the person did suffer certain harm. So that one type of evidence that the person may produce. It is very important to understand that evidence, the best evidence, of course, is evidence what we call concurrent evidence, evidence that records the events as they were happening. But it's possible also to introduce evidence of something, of these recordings of the events that were created after the fact, like this doctor's testimony that happened. The doctor evaluated you maybe a year after the events took place, but those types of that type of evidence, those types of documents are still valid. It's still a valid form of evidence in the United States courts. So that's important to know. So somebody who has, well, I don't have any evidence, it's not true. You just need to think, and a lawyer usually helps you to go through this process and say, hey, listen, maybe we can contact this person who will who might confirm this or that fact. Maybe if you look through your records that you do have, you'll be able to find something. So that's how you can prove the facts. Also, what's very helpful in court is a country condition expert, is a use of an expert. It's basically a person who, usually a professor from a law school, or somebody who is working for a non-for-profit organization. Well, it basically can be anybody really with a sufficient knowledge. The only problems that we usually have here is that the qualifications of an expert. The person has to be credible. The person has to be knowledgeable about what he or she is going to be testifying about. But it's somebody who can say that, yes, in fact, I got familiar with the facts, let's say that the country of Ukraine and what's happening there. And I can say that this particular group of people is being persecuted because 1, 2, 3, something like that. So that is another type of evidence that one can introduce. It's a country condition expert. Apart from that, what other things a person may introduce or submit together with the asylum application? Well, it's country condition reports. It can be article. It can be, of course, we start with the reports by United States Department of State. Country conditions. It's available, and usually, actually, the government introduces those reports because they're so-called official records of what's happening in the country. Even though sometimes they're not accurate, sometimes they do not reflect accurately and fully everything that happens. The report might not take into consideration that there are other groups or may not reflect that there are other groups that are being persecuted. Also, there is one interesting thing about these reports. They usually come out in March, sometimes April or May of the year. And they talk, what I mean by that is that the report about country conditions in 2014 will be published only in March of 2015. So if one files for asylum in January or February, he or she will have to rely on other information available. Reports maybe of such organizations as Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, or just articles from different newspapers or online resources that would or can confirm applicant's story. So that's another type of evidence that one can submit. So it's never the case that one says, well, I don't have anything to confirm that. I guarantee that that person can find something to confirm their story. They just have not looked far enough into the question. So that's another type of evidence. Now, is one obligated to submit evidence? Yes, the one is obligated to submit evidence. The short answer is yes. There is a special law in the United States called Real ID Act that actually requires an applicant for asylum to provide available evidence confirming the applicant's story, claim. If, for some reason, it is reasonable to expect certain evidence to exist, and the person does not have that evidence, cannot produce, the person has to provide an explanation why he or she cannot produce that type of evidence. For example, the person says, well, I was beaten up, they broke my arm, but the person does not attach a copy of the medical record of that. The judge will ask the applicant, or the asylum officer will ask the applicant, well, where is the record? And one has to explain. And it's legal to require such an explanation because, as I said, there's a Real ID Act that says that one has to present, maybe not word to word, but the meaning of the act is that one has to present as much corroborating evidence as possible. What other evidence one may produce or should attach with an asylum claim? Well, sometimes we attach, of course, photos, videos, but the most important thing I think to remember here is that one should spend considerable time thinking about what happened, who could have witnessed what happened. Even if the person, even if potential witness did not witness the actual beating or the actual protest, maybe after the protest, the applicant went to this person or called that person and complained about what happened or told the person what happened. So events in a theory, in a philosophy, let's say, or theory of events, I don't know how to correctly phrase it, but there is such a theory that says no event happens without a trace. So basically, anything that happens in this world always would have a trace. And one of the skills that a lawyer, a good attorney develops is to be able to ascertain, to understand, and to try to track those traces, basically. That's why probably one of the main reasons why people hire an attorney for to help them with asylum claim, so that the lawyer would think and help the applicant to produce, to first determine what uh, what can be uh, attached to the asylum claim, and then help that person to contact or think how to contact different resources in aggregate to really show that the claim does have merits, a merit. I do have some blogs published on my website in English, and some of them are in Russian regarding this issue. And I invite all of you to visit the website www.shautsova.com. It's my last name.com to get more information on the topic. I also have something that's called Asylum Library. I try publish their interesting cases regarding asylum claims, how the judges viewed the claims, what they consider to be relevant or irrelevant, sufficient and insufficient evidence, because it's all very relevant when somebody is, especially when somebody is appearing pro se without a lawyer. If you let's say you don't have money and you couldn't secure a pro bono counsel, you should visit the website and get familiar with those cases, so you will understand what is expected from you. Because there are certain expectations in the legal system. Even though you might think that you have the strongest claim in the world because everything that you're saying is true, the judge or asylum officer would still expect from you certain evidence, and that's important to know that. And it's important to do your best to prepare for that interview, for that court date. So I hope it was, this short presentation was a little bit helpful to you if you're considering applying for asylum. And you're always welcome to find me through my website or by calling my office at 917-885-2261. Thank you very much.